The subcommittee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recesses of the subcommittee at any time. We welcome everyone in this afternoon's oversight hearing on the Federal Bureau of Prisons and the implementation of the First Step Act. I'll now recognize myself for an opening statement. I first want to acknowledge the loss of a great giant and champion for criminal justice reform, our colleague, Mr. Elijah Cummings. We were all shocked by his passing this morning, and our hearing was a little bit delayed as we took the opportunity to acknowledge him on the floor of the House a few minutes ago. As he recently stated, the American people demanded that their representatives in Washington fight for them and for what affects their lives on a day-to-day basis. That is precisely what is being done when we hold oversight hearings such as these, and today, of course, we will hold it in his memory. The First Step Act is a bipartisan measure signed into law on December 2018. Since its enactment, we have been monitoring its implementation. The process has generated a series of questions and raised valid concerns. Today's hearing is an opportunity to have an open discussion about the status of the First Step Act. We will evaluate how the law has progressed in the past 10 months with the goal of ensuring that it meets its intended purpose to be a legitimate first step toward reforming our criminal justice system. The First Step Act is the result of years of discussion, vigorous debates, and a reflection of both of the dedication and determination of all those involved. The bill doesn't attempt to address all the ills within our current system. As the title reflects, we are just at the beginning of a very long process. It has established federal prison reforms and generated important, though modest, improvements to our sentencing laws. Specifically, it allowed the 2010 Fair Sentencing Act to apply retroactively. It scaled back certain harsh and unjust sentencing practices and is helping to ensure that we address mass incarceration at the front end rather than simply at the back end. The law expands the eligibility of defendants for safety valve relief, which allows for judicial discretion to depart from a mandatory minimum sentence in certain instances. A provision in this law eliminated the ability to stack firearm enhancements within the same indictment, which has historically resulted in excessive sentences. These are just some of the sentencing reform provisions in this law, and we should continue to build upon them. As for the prison reform efforts, this law addresses a number of issues related to conditions and places of confinement in our Federal Bureau of Prisons, including, for instance, a ban on the shackling of pregnant prisoners during labor and delivery. The law also provides for a significant expansion of recidivism reduction programming as part of the earned time credit system, and I'm pleased that we were able to get some of the major issues addressed. However, like every new program, there are trials and errors. Where we applaud the many positive things about this law, we must honestly address any shortcomings early in the process to ensure this law lives up to its intended purpose. This is why Congress routinely conducts oversight hearings to provide transparency, to ensure well-intentioned laws are functioning as we intended them to, and to provide solutions for any unintended consequences. I know one unintended consequence that has received a great deal of media attention is the fact that one of the individuals who was released because of First Step then was involved in a horrific crime that resulted in the death of someone. And I know that there will be other weaknesses that we determine in the law, but I hope that this does not detract from the need in our country to really examine our criminal justice system. In addition to discussing the progress made thus far with the First Step Act implementation, I would also like to hear about the overall conditions of BOP. For example, the problem that happened with some of the conditions in the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, the problem that they had with the extremely cold temperatures during a 7-day partial power outage in New York. We have a lot to discuss, and therefore I want to thank both panels of witnesses for coming, and I look forward to your testimony. It's now my pleasure to recognize the ranking member for his comments.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank you for holding this important hearing today on oversight of the Bureau of Prisons. Last year, Congress passed and the President signed into law one of the most sweeping criminal justice reform measures in recent history. The First Step Act was the product of lengthy bipartisan and bicameral negotiations. Today, we're again working in a bipartisan fashion to ensure that First Step Act is properly and effectively implemented. If the First Step Act is not implemented correctly, there will be no subsequent steps. And as a Republican sponsor of bipartisan legislation that would seal criminal records for certain nonviolent offenders, I want to make sure that we see more done on criminal justice reform. My first elected office was that of a district judge, which is really the front lines of the criminal justice system. In that position, I handled everything from traffic issues to truancy to even preliminary hearings on murder cases, and sometimes all in the same day. It was truly an eye-opening experience. And it helped me understand that ultimately we can reduce crime by ending the revolving door between prison and the streets. You can be strong on crime while also being smart on crime. I would also like to examine the issues affecting our correctional officers' safety, including new methods for bringing contraband into prisons, understaffing, and prosecution for assaulting officers. Just a few weeks ago, I heard firsthand from CEOs at USP Hazleton about threats that they face every day. We must do more to keep these men and women safe, both on the job and at home with their families. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses and about the issues and so much more as we move forward with criminal justice reform. Thank you, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
We'll now hear from the ranking member of the full committee.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate that. Welcome, Director Cox-Sawyer and Associate Deputy Attorney General Bacon. I want to thank both of you for your service and for you are here with us today. And I also want to thank Ms. Bass. This hearing is one that I have waited for since basically we started this session. I'm glad to have it, and thank you for finally coming, and the full committee chairman as well. The Bureau of Prisons is tasked with protecting society by confining offenders in the controlled environments of prisons, community-based facilities that are safe, humane, cost-efficient, and appropriately secure, and that provide work and for other self-improvement opportunities to assist offenders in becoming law-abiding citizens. It is the duty of the BOP not to merely provide housing, food, and security for federal inmates, but to assist those inmates in becoming law-abiding citizens upon their release. All Americans have an interest in that because we all know the vast majority of federal inmates, well above 90%, will someday be released regardless of what efforts have been done to reduce recidivism. I don't think anything happens in random chance. I believe, frankly, and from my faith perspective, God has his hand upon everything. And today is an amazing day in which we celebrate the homegoing of Elijah Cummings, one who influenced this body in amazing ways. He had as I spoke earlier today, and I will not reflect on those words from earlier today, but he had an amazing way to connect with people that other people didn't connect with from an amazing position of power. And he did so with a heart and compassion. But today is also a day with this hearing, after it had been hopefully be scheduled for so many times in the previous months, we get to it today, a celebration of the First Step Act. With my friend Hakeem Jeffries, who is not here right now, I think Elijah would be very pleased with what has come. With a bill that he and I introduced this year, the FAIR Act, which we actually take this a step further in gaining employment for those who have been incarcerated and removing barriers to that. In this room today, from several of the rows back that I see the faces, there are those who have benefited from the First Step Act. That you're here today because of what happened when a body came together and saw beyond our differences and saw what we could do together. I see the advocates who have been here, in which we have laughed, we have cried, we have struggled, but we see something actually come. Today's hearing is one that is long overdue, but it is also one that is welcomed in the environment in which we have today. And when we understand that, when we see the Bureau of Prison, we see the Department of Justice coming together and taking seriously what this Congress said that we want to see happen here and giving us good input, and I'm so glad to see, Director, you're back, and we've talked about this before. This is what we're supposed to be about. So for those who are here today, who have benefited from something from Congress, consider yourself lucky. Most of what we do seems to not benefit a lot of people. but for you, it benefited. This committee can do this. As Elijah Cummings was so fond of saying, we're better than where we are. We're better than this. And this is a good day for this hearing. It's a good day to show what we can do when we understand that people and policy are what we're about, not what we talk about. Thank you for being here. And Madam Chair, thank you for holding this hearing. I yield back.
And thank you very much, Representative Collins. I appreciate you mentioning our colleague, Hakeem Jeffries. I'm sure he will be with us shortly. And between the two of you, played the leading role in making sure the first step got to the finish line. And you also mentioned and acknowledged the audience. And I just would like to take a moment and ask for those people that benefited by First Step, if you would please stand. In another setting, perhaps in a more informal briefing, I think that it would be very helpful and important to hear some of your stories. There is nothing like putting a face and a story to policy that we attempt to develop and implement here. Now I want to introduce our witnesses. We will now hear from our first panel. Dr. Kathleen Hawk-Sawyer is the director of the Bureau of Prisons, and Antoinette Bacon, who is an Associate Deputy Attorney General with the Department of Justice and is steering the implementation of the FSA and the risk assessment tool developed to implement it. The prisoner assessment tool targeting estimated risk and needs or pattern. Thank you both for joining us today. We welcome our witnesses and thank them for participating in today's hearing. Now, if you would please rise, I will begin by swearing you in. Raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you are about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, so help you God? Thank you. Let the record show the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Thank you, and please be seated. Please note that your written statements will be entered into the record in their entirety. Accordingly, I ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes. To help you stay within that time, there is a timing light on your table. When the light switches from green to yellow, you will have 1 minute to conclude your testimony. When the light turns red, it signals that your 5 minutes have expired. Thank you, Dr. Sawyer and Dr. Bacon. We will now proceed to your testimony.
Good afternoon, Chairwoman Bass and Congressman Reschenthaler. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss with you today the mission and the operations of the Bureau of Prisons and our progress in implementing the First Step Act. I thank the Judiciary Committee for their work over the many years in support of the Bureau of Prisons. This subcommittee in particular has been integral to our operations for many decades, including years of tremendous population growth, rapid expansion, and the opening of many new institutions. I thank you and your colleagues for your groundbreaking criminal justice reform work through the bipartisan support of the First Step Act. Programming to assist inmates in returning to their communities as law-abiding citizens has always been a cornerstone of our mission. In fact, we have long held that an inmate's re-entry journey begins the very day they enter our custody. And with the First Step Act, we look forward to further enriching those offerings to help improve the lives of our inmates and thereby help keep our communities safer. I was honored 2 months ago to be selected by the Attorney General to return to lead the Bureau of Prisons and to work alongside the finest corrections professionals in the world. I began my career as a psychology intern at one of our prisons and held positions of increasing responsibility from associate warden to warden. And before my original appointment as the Bureau's 6th director in 1992, a position I held until my retirement in 2003. While much has changed since my last term as director, the foundation of the Bureau is sound. But we have been challenged by the dramatic growth that we experienced, commensurate with the budget cuts that followed the tragedy of 9/11, and the shift of focus from crime to terrorism. These factors have seriously strained the Bureau. Our over 35,000 staff play a critical role in the criminal justice system, yet the great work our staff does every day goes largely unseen by the American public. This inherently dangerous work, particularly at our high-security facilities where we house our most dangerous inmates, is a responsibility we take very seriously. Unfortunately, we have experienced significant staff shortages that make our job even more difficult. In my first 8 weeks As director, I have placed great emphasis on filling the almost 3,700 vacancies nationwide. Also in my first 8 weeks, I have mobilized a thorough systems overview to identify areas of strengths and weaknesses, and have identified 3 initial areas of emphasis. One is staffing, one is training, and one is an emphasis on the basics of sound correctional practice. Our system is the largest in the nation, housing over 176,000 inmates across the United States. And this return to the bedrock of sound corrections is critical to ensure that staff nationwide are following the policies and procedures that keep staff, inmates, and the public safe. The Bureau, like corrections nationwide, also continues to face dangerous security threats from the introduction of contraband. Synthetic drugs, illicit narcotics, and contraband cell phones are some of the chief threats. The use of drones to drop contraband onto prison grounds is an ongoing problem that continues to evolve. We have deployed contraband detecting technologies, and we continue to leverage new technology and cutting-edge solutions to effectively detect and interdict prison contraband. Our aging infrastructure is another area of concern. Almost half of our prisons are over 30 years old, and some, like Leavenworth, Atlanta, and Lewisburg, date back over 80 years to the very beginnings of the Bureau of Prisons. Prison facilities are subjected to much heavier than normal wear, since they are continuously used 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. This aging infrastructure affects institution security, as critical systems sustain extensive wear and tear, as well as premature deterioration. We are focusing on repairing and/or replacing key systems, but require significant funding to ensure that all facilities can be maintained as continued infrastructure decline occurs. The implementation of the First Step Act is a priority for the Bureau, and I am pleased to report that we have made great progress. We have updated policies, are implementing the many requirements of the Act. We are working closely with the Department of Justice and the Independent Review Committee on new risk and needs assessment that the Act requires. We've listened to the important comments of the many interested stakeholders, from crime victims to a broad array of advocacy groups. The statutory timelines in the Act were formidable, but I am proud to say that the Bureau and the Department have met key deadlines, particularly the release of the new risk and needs assessment system, and we continue to remain focused on the full and balanced implementation of the First Step Act. That concludes my formal statement, and I would be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you. Ms. Bacon.
Good afternoon, Chairwoman Bass, Mr. Reschenthaler, and members of the committee. I'm Antoinette Bacon, Associate Deputy Attorney General, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here today to discuss the Department of Justice's ongoing efforts to fully implement the First Step Act. Both the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General have consistently and emphatically stated that the Department will work diligently to implement the First Step Act, and they both have been actively engaged in these efforts. For example, both have met with the Independent Review Committee to learn from this group of highly esteemed experts, and each visited a BOP facility to see firsthand the quality education and vocational programs, and to speak with inmates and staff who participate in these programs and deliver these programs. Following their lead, our team has worked tirelessly to ensure that the Act's many reforms are implemented in a way that reduces recidivism, that provides opportunities to offenders, and that protects our communities. The written testimony contains greater detail on this, but in my remarks, I would like to highlight several ways in which the Department has been demonstrating its commitment to the Act. First, we met the very ambitious July 19th deadline to publish a new risk and needs assessment system called Pattern. Pattern obtains the highest level of predictability of any current system. It contains 17 different factors, 11 of which are dynamic, which means that they can change during a period of incarceration. And Pattern was validated for males and female inmates separately. Importantly, DOJ did not create Pattern in a vacuum. Instead, we consulted with the Independent Review Committee, the Administrative Office for U.S. Courts, the National Institute of Corrections, and over 24 diverse stakeholder groups. Then, once announced, we opened Pattern to a 45-day study period to solicit additional input, including input from BOP's union. We are currently reviewing all of this feedback and are working in collaboration with the Independent Review Committee to identify appropriate changes to the tool. Going forward, the department is committed to studying patterns' effectiveness. We want to know if it's working. To that end, the National Institute of Justice has just announced an intention to release a solicitation to evaluate and to validate the tool. Based on that research, along with other data, we fully intend to refine and make appropriate changes to the tool going forward. Developing pattern was only one part of the First Step Act. The department has had equally robust implementation with the Act's other requirements, which include, for example, reduced sentences. On July 19th, the Deputy Attorney General announced that approximately 3,100 federal prison inmates were released from BOP custody as a result of the increase in good conduct time that the Act allowed. As of last week, approximately 2,139 inmates have received sentencing reductions pursuant to the retroactive application of the Fair Sentencing Act of 2010, which closed that gap or narrowed that gap between crack and powder cocaine sentencing. Second key area is effective reentry programming. Helping offenders successfully reintegrate into the community is a key factor in preventing and reducing recidivism, and really finding gainful employment, getting a good job, is part of that process. To further that goal, BOP has launched a Ready to Work initiative which connects private employers looking to hire returning citizens with inmates nearing release. To further assist with reentry, the Deputy Attorney General announced that the Department of Justice has prioritized $75 million in order to fully fund the First Step Act to its authorized FY19 level. And that funding is being used in a variety of ways, including helping with job readiness by increasing vocational opportunities, by expanding education programs, including providing English as a second language workbooks and textbooks, and helping the female inmate population by expanding access to programs that are targeted specifically to females' needs. These are just some of the ways we're working to faithfully implement the First Step Act, and I look forward to working with you as we seek to provide opportunities, reduce recidivism, and protect our communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll now begin our 5 minutes of questioning, and I will begin. I'd like to ask Honorable Hawk Sawyer, in terms of the implementation and specifically the provisions in the First Step Act that addressed pregnant women. And so my question is, what has changed in the BOP in regard to pregnant women?
A couple of things have changed. Some we really did not need to change. We did not historically really use shackling of female pregnant inmates to any extent in reality. If we had an inmate that was acting out in some way to where it threatened the life of the inmate themselves and especially their unborn child, we would at times have to restrain them. And so we have put clearly into our...
What does acting out mean?
Some of our pregnant women have mental health issues also. They're the typical issues that
Right.
some of our inmates have. And so when they're flailing about, fighting our staff, resisting any kind of calmer interaction, then we feel that we do have to subdue them. And we do it as gently as we possibly can. And when necessary, restrain them. And just to tell you, since
how would they be restrained?
they could have handcuffs placed on them. They could be, have their arms attached to a chair until we calm them down. But to the chairwoman's concern, this has occurred once in the last year. It's not something that we do except when it's absolutely necessary. The way in which the change that has occurred, though, is we have defined this even more explicitly in our policy. We have instituted a reporting system where if it ever occurs, it needs to be notified up through the ranks till we find out about it. And the part we did change, though, is we were never as clear on postpartum inmates.
So also during pregnancy, so I'm not talking about labor and delivery, but I'm talking about pregnancy.
Right.
Women then are not routinely, they do not routinely have chains around their waist. They don't routinely have chains on their
We don't
feet.
handcuff them. We don't
have
use the
handcuffs when
chains.
they're being transported around the facility.
Exactly. And when a woman first comes to our institution, we automatically do a pregnancy check because sometimes they come in and don't even realize they're pregnant.
Right.
And so we make them very aware of their condition if they are pregnant. We put it very clearly in their file so that any staff interacting with them know that they're pregnant. And we are very cautious to make sure we do not restrain pregnant women in any way. And as I indicated, the real change for us has been in the postpartum women. We were not as clear and explicit. We now have it clearly in policy that for 12 weeks after delivery, we are utilizing the same, treating them in the same way we do during the course of the pregnancy.
Wonderful, thank you very much. I'd like to ask Ms. Bacon about the assessment tool. I think there was a request made from the committee to see the assessment tool, and I was wondering if you have it available for us to look at.
Yeah, so currently, the department is taking under consideration the approximately 170 comments we received during the 45-day study period and working in close collaboration with the Independent Review
Let
Committee.
me ask you something about those comments. So people were commenting, they saw the tool and they were commenting on the tool?
They saw the tool as described in the report that the Department of Justice issued on July 19th.
They didn't actually see the tool itself?
That's correct.
And so do you have the tool available so that we can see it? I understand you're reviewing it and all of that, but I would like to see what the instrument is.
Yes, the tool is not yet complete because we are still taking into account not only the approximately 170 comments, but also the Independent Review Committee had a
So
series
it's not actually being used right now?
It is not
because
being
it's
used
not
right now.
finished? Okay, so, but when part of the criticism of First Step, the release of a couple of individuals who have committed crimes, I think there was the assumption that they were assessed and something happened. So how are people released if there's not a risk assessment tool available?
Currently, they're being assessed under the existing BOP system, which is called Bravo. And that tool was designed many years ago in order to assess risk of prison misconduct and to try to determine what is the risk level while
Do
incarcerated.
you have that instrument I could see?
Yes, that
An older
instrument
I would like to
is
see that.
available.
I would like to see that. And then also, when are you going to finish the feedback, and when will the RFP be available?
We are working very diligently to update the tool, to make any necessary updates from the listening session and from the Independent Review Committee suggestions, train all of the BOP employees, work with the BOP union if necessary and appropriate on any changes, and have everybody screened.
So we'd
the
like to
tool.
see that, as well, in terms of formal comments. And then when you do have an RFP, it will be, who are you looking for to evaluate it?
Yes, the RFP will be issued through the National Institute of Justice open to anyone who qualifies under the terms of the RFP. What we're
When do
really
you
trying
think
to
it'll be available?
My understanding is in the very near future.
Okay.
Because the goal is to have not only the BOP and not only the Independent Review Committee and not only the experts that NIJ hired, but yet another group who all will have access to the data and can each independently verify and test and work with each other to make sure that the
That's good.
tools...
I'm about ready to run out of time. That's very helpful, and I would like to be notified when that RFP, before it's going to be released, because when you look at evaluation, who evaluates it is very critical, and what their experience is with different populations, their cultural, awareness, et cetera, is critical to an evaluation. And so making sure that that RFP is widely available to different groups is very important. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This question is for both witnesses. I know that the President is deeply committed to the First Step Act, and AG Barr has stated that he is in lockstep with the President in ensuring swift implementation. Can you just broadly address what you are doing to ensure that this bipartisan measure is successful, and if you could provide a timetable on when those in prison will be able to take advantage of the recidivism reduction programming in the First Step Act?
Yes, the Attorney General is deeply committed to ensuring that the First Step Act is fully and fairly implemented and has been personally involved since the beginning in ensuring that we were on pace to meet the deadlines, as evidenced by our ability to meet the July 19th deadline, which was quite ambitious. We did not stop at July 19th. In fact, we saw that as the work just beginning. From July 19th to today, we have been laser focused on working on building up the needs part of the needs assessment system, and also in really taking the feedback we've received and challenging ourselves to see how we can improve the system, the pattern as drafted. And we are currently on pace to meet all of the deadlines that are in the statute.
Do you want me to
Do
follow
you have
on?
anything to add?
Well, I would just say that we have already begun training our staff. Even though we do not have the final needs assessment yet, we are already starting up the training for our staff to have them prepared to move forward once the risk assessment is completed, and to actually move forward on the needs assessment portion of it also to identify the needs. We're also looking at the program offerings that we have available in the Bureau of Prisons, and we have received some funding during this past fiscal year to increase the program offerings in a number of our education, vocational training areas, and our specific program areas, and we're kind of planning out the year ahead with monies we requested into next year of additional programs we'll be able to add to have available to the inmates also.
Thank you. My next question is about COs. A correctional officer can be responsible for, as you know, supervising as many as 150 inmates at once, and the COs are unarmed inside the facilities. It's my understanding that that insufficient staffing levels and a more aggressive inmate population have led to a spike in violence. What is the BOP doing to prevent violence against staff? And also, if you have these statistics, how many assaults took place last year? How many of these assaults led to criminal prosecutions?
Okay, I do not have the information here today on the numbers of assaults and prosecutions, but we'll be very happy to get those for you. Staff safety is our most critical concern, absolutely. And the vacancies we have in staffing right now are just unacceptable. They've come about because of several years of uncertainty about our budgets, uncertainty about the number of positions we were allowed to fill. There's just been a lot of concern with how much money we were going to have and how many positions we were going to have each year. It's caused us to fall back in terms of filling positions. Now we're ramping up absolutely dramatically and trying to fill these positions. Since I've become the director, we've initiated a number of new things. We're getting some new authorities from OPM. We're trying to get direct hire authority at the institutions. We've hired up like 24 more staff in our staffing area just to help process the new employees coming on board. We've ramped up our recruiting. We're doing everything we can to get the right bodies coming on board, get them through the very slow hiring process in the federal government, and getting them into our institutions as quickly as possible. Some of the things we've done in terms of protecting our staff, we've gone the last few years to providing stab-proof vests for our employees because that was an issue of concern for some years where some of our employees were actually being stabbed by the inmates. We have stab-proof vests for everyone. They're required in all of our higher security institutions. They do not carry weapons, but they carry like a pepper spray canister with them, which enables them to break down any disruptive inmates very quickly and stop any aggressive action. We do everything we can to try to keep our staff safe, but filling up these positions is critical. As you know from Hazleton, the new warden there has done a wonderful job of getting his staffing level up almost to full complement. And so it's just a matter of us getting all of our institutions up to that level of staffing.
Just one follow-up question on staffing. I'm being told that that nurses and administrative personnel are being used to supervise inmates. One, is this true? And two, is there anything being done to curb this augmentation of staff?
Augmentation is an integral part of how we do business. I started as a psychology intern in the Bureau of Prisons. I had to cover posts for correctional officers. We all are trained as correctional workers first. We all have the same basic correctional training. So when a teacher is teaching, they don't have a correctional officer in that classroom to guard the inmates while the teacher is responsible for overseeing those inmates. When I did therapy groups as a psychologist, I was responsible for providing security. Our work detail supervisors, they're responsible. We're all trained as correctional officers officers first. And so what's happened, though, more recently with the lower staffing, we've had to use augmentation more than we would like to. And so we need to get us back to a level where augmenting is good, because, I went from a psychology intern to a warden. Had I not have had all those experiences along the way of working other posts and details, I would have been ill-prepared to move into those jobs. So it's a way we develop and train our staff, but our problem today is we're using augmentation too much because our staffing levels are too low. And so we need to get it up to a level of appropriate augmentation, but not overly so.
Thank you, and we've been joined by the chair of the full committee, Mr. Nadler. Yeah.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I ask unanimous consent that my opening statement be placed in the record. Thank you. Ms. Sawyer, Nydia Velasquez and I were witnesses at the Brooklyn Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn to rather catastrophic conditions back in, I think, January or February. And the Inspector General's report recommends that the MDC upgrade its heating, ventilation, and cooling equipment and put in place a system to automatically monitor temperatures throughout the facility. It's now been 10 months since the crisis. Have those upgrades been made?
We have made most of them, Congressman. We've been working diligently to make all the improvements on both the electrical side and the heating and air conditioning side. On the heating side, we have gone through all of our heating equipment, done all the preventive maintenance, checked all the coils and the wires and everything you could possibly check. The thing we have not yet done because we have to get the funding for it and then put it into place, are the sensors that we would like to have located around the institution to tell us exactly what the temperature is in each area of the institution. Because as you know, during your visit, it was very warm in some parts of the institution and not warm enough in other parts of the institution. And controlling a large building is very difficult. So right now we're doing it with handheld sensors. We're going around the institution with handheld sensors and checking the temperature all the time, very regularly, and having to convey that back to the powerhouse. The new sensors, which will be coming in the near future, will be permanently placed around the housing units and around the institution. They will immediately feed back electronically the information on the temperatures to the powerhouse so that it can be regulated very quickly and regularly. That we are still in the process of installing, but we have made significant improvements to the heating area. Pardon me, sir?
When do you think they'll be finished?
I don't have a specific date. I'd be very happy to get that to you, sir.
I mean, we're talking 2 months, 2 years?
We're talking about months.
Okay.
Months.
And one of the things that really shocked me was that they had no census or information as to which inmates required, let's say, CPAP machines or oxygen machines. And when the power went out, those people were helpless. They could have had strokes or whatever. What's been done about that?
Well, at the time when this thing was occurring, Congressman, we offered those inmates who needed the CPAPs to move to the other housing. The one building had power and heat. It was okay. It was the west wing, the west building that had the power and the heating problems. We offered them to move, and they elected not to move over. But still, that's our responsibility. That was our fault for not having a backup plan for them right away. We now have in our regulations there at the institution what the plan is. The plan is we will not ask them if they want to move. We will move them over to where the power is available to them and make sure that they can plug in their CPAP equipment and make sure we know exactly who those inmates are. The officers there will know who they are, and we can get them right back onto the CPAP immediately.
Okay, now the IG report also says that until the upgrades we talked about a minute ago, the temperature monitors are made, including the monitoring system, the inmates should be given long-sleeve clothing, thermal underwear, or other cold weather clothing as part of their standard issue attire, rather than the short-sleeved attire they get now. With winter approaching, has that been done? Absolutely.
In fact, we're giving them all coats as well, just in case. Just in case. We're giving them extra clothing. We make our own blankets in the federal prison industry, so we should never be without enough blankets. So we're giving them plenty of blankets, plenty of warm clothing, and we're actually giving every inmate a coat, just in case.
Okay. And are you reviewing the status of all federal correctional facilities to determine whether similar problems exist there and take appropriate steps to ensure that what happened at MDC Brooklyn doesn't take place elsewhere?
Yes, sir, we are. We've initiated, all of these institutions should be reviewed within every 1 to 3 years in terms of a complete relook at the heating and air conditioning and electrical systems. Again, because many of our institutions are so old, preventive maintenance and a lot of the money that we should be putting into this equipment has just not been forthcoming to do all the work we would like to do. But we're trying to target the ones that we think could be more vulnerable than others and eventually get to all of the the institutions to make sure.
I have two more questions
Okay,
in
I'm
45
sorry.
seconds. One of the issues that took place at MDC was that visitation was cut off of families and attorneys. As a result, for a period that was too long, no one on the outside knew what was going on inside. Families in particular were very anxious and frankly terrified not to know what was going on with their loved ones. Has MDC taken any measures to ensure that families and attorneys are kept informed if anything like this ever, God forbid, happens again? And what specific measures have been taken?
Right. One of our biggest failings at that institution on that situation was communication. They were so busy trying to fix the heating and air conditioning, heating and electrical problems, we forgot to be quite as aggressive at letting all of our stakeholders know, the family members, the federal courts. We have policy in place.
You're doing that now.
We've made contacts to repair some of the damage, too.
Thank you. In the 1 second I have left,
Sorry.
my last question is, one of the things that was shocking to me was that there didn't seem to be any emergency plan in place at that point. Has that been rectified?
Yes, we had an emergency plan. We didn't have an emergency plan authority. We didn't have the person in place that was supposed to be making sure that that emergency plan was activated right away. That person is now in place. The emergency plan is there. God forbid this occur again, but if it does, we should be much better prepared to deal with it, sir.
Thank you. My time is well expired.
Representative Shabbat?
Thank you very much, and Madam Chair, I'd like to commend you on holding this hearing. I think it's a very important hearing. And I'd like to focus much of my attention on the prison industries program, Unicor, now. I've been a longtime big supporter of that group and trying to keep them going in the right direction. And I would just note that most of the people that inhabit our federal prisons will one day get out. There are exceptions. We have people that have obviously murdered, multiple people, and the likelihood of them getting out may be somewhat slim. But most of these folks are going to get out. So to the extent, and that's the case at the local level as well. So to the extent that we're able to get these folks marketable skills that they can put to use when they get out, makes it much less likely that they're going to revert back to crime. It's my understanding, for example, that you all have something called the Post-Release Employment Project, and if I've got my numbers straight, I believe that if they were in federal prison industries and got a skill, there's something like a 24% less of a chance that they will end up back in crime when they get out. Would you like to talk about that?
That's absolutely true, Congressman, and I testified before you on prison industries issues 20 years ago, so I know you were a strong supporter of that program back then. And it is one of our most powerful programs, and it's evidence-based that it does have a significant impact upon recidivism. The 24% that you recall is exactly right, that it's a 24% less likely that an inmate is going to return to crime when they hit the streets, and it's also a 15% likelihood, increase in likelihood that they're going to be productively employed, a tax-paying citizen back in the community. It's a powerful program. And at one time, when I was director before, 20 years ago, we had 28,000 inmates in federal prison industries. We are now at only 11,000 inmates in prison industries. It's our authorities and our ability to be a mandatory source purchase agent from all of the federal government has been eroded a lot over the years, and it's harder and harder for us to get the kinds of work and orders that we need in order to employ the kind of inmates we did before. We still make 80-some different product lines. It was 22 different product lines when I was here before, but we're down to 80-some product lines. We try to diversify as much as possible so that we don't impact any particular industry in this country. We have gotten some new authorities through the First Step Act, which we're hopeful are going to help us raise those numbers a little bit, but we need all the help we can get to advance our authorities, and if we really want to impact inmates through the First Step Act, federal prison industries is a critical area that we can do that.
Thank you. And I mean, I certainly understand, I happen to be I was, for the last two Congresses, the chairman of the House Small Business Committee. I'm now the ranking member of the House Small Business Committee. So there are some folks, business folks that are concerned about the competition. I certainly understand. I think we can work through this, though, and I would like to see an expansion of the number of inmates that are qualified to be in the program so that we can get job skills for a lot more of these people who, again, will someday be out on the street. We don't want them preying on the public. We want them to have marketable skills, and be able to obtain a job and be self-supporting. So the First Step Act, is my understanding that before last year, only federal government agencies could buy products manufactured by federal inmates. But with the enactment of the First Step Act, Section 605 expanded the potential purchasers to, for example, the District of Columbia, so the government of District of Columbia here in Washington, some nonprofit entities, and in disaster relief and emergency response efforts. Is that correct?
Yes, that is.
Okay, so I would hope that that's something else that we could work on. It's also my understanding, as far as the federal government, about 50% of the products go to the Defense Department. Is that right?
They are, I don't know if it's exactly 50%, but they are our biggest purchaser, yes.
Okay. And then some of the other agencies is Homeland Security, the Justice Department, Department of Transportation, Treasury, Veterans Administration, the Bureau of Prisons itself, the GSA, Social Security Administration, and the Postal Service.
Yes, yes.
Does that sound right?
Yes.
And the products, we're talking about textiles, office furniture, recycling, and a number of other things. So let me just conclude with this, because my time's almost expired. Anything that we can do to get marketable skills to those that are inhabiting our prisons, both at the local and especially at the federal level, since we're here at the federal level, I think we're doing incredible good for society overall, because these people will come out someday, and they ought to be working and supporting themselves, not preying on the public. So,
Thank you, Congressman, for your support.
thank you very much, and I yield back.
Mr. Jeffries?
Thank you, Madam Chair, for your leadership, and I also want to thank, of course, my good friend Doug Collins for his tremendous leadership of the First Step Act, and Chairman Nadler, all the distinguished members of the committee. Before I begin my questioning, I just had a statement for the record that reads in part. It's from Jay Chattel, who is the nephew of Troy Pine, of course, who was a young man who was tragically killed on Wednesday, October 2nd in Providence, Rhode Island, by someone who was released pursuant to the retroactive application of the Fair Sentencing Act of 2010. And the statement in part reads, "My uncle was a truly great man, and his loss has devastated my family. No family should have to go through this. But to blame President Trump or the First Step Act is 100% wrong. This bill was passed with good intentions. Way too many people are in jail for way too long. Nobody should use my family's name or pain for a political agenda. At the funeral, my brother spoke of the need for love and forgiveness, and I wish the world had heard it. Anyone who speaks my uncle's name, please speak it in a way that will draw people together and bring help to people in these communities, including human beings who have been locked up for too long. Speak it in a way that brings healing to people who need it. My family is about God's love and grace. I hope you will join us in this effort. God bless you all." I just ask unanimous consent that the statement be entered into the record. Certainly our thoughts and prayers are with the family of Troy Pine. Director Sawyer, the First Step Act is designed to help currently incarcerated individuals successfully reenter society. Is that true?
Yes, sir.
And according to the U.S. Sentencing Commission, almost 1/3 of federal offenders are reconvicted in the 8 years after reentering the community. Is that correct?
It's about 40% in the federal system.
And the First Step Act was crafted to sort of reduce this recidivism by helping to bring to life programs that provide education, job training, substance abuse treatment, mental health counseling. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
And the research shows that inmates who participate in correctional education programs, for instance, are significantly less likely to recidivate. Is that right?
Yes.
You know, for example, I think there was a May 2018 report that the White House Council of Economic Advisors issued that concluded that mental health programs reduce recidivism by approximately 21% and substance abuse programs by 17%. Is that correct?
I'm not familiar with those numbers. They sound correct, but I don't know.
That's consistent with the literature as it relates to the impact of similar programs on recidivism. Is that true?
Yes.
Would you agree that implementing the First Step Act is the right thing to do for individuals, families, and communities that have been devastated by what I would characterize as the failed war on drugs?
I absolutely support the First Step Act, absolutely, sir.
And would you agree that reducing recidivism improves public safety in communities throughout the country?
Yes.
Is it fair to say also that reducing recidivism saves taxpayer dollars as well by reducing the need for incarceration and the cost of prosecution and things of that nature? Is that correct?
Yes, sir. We have often said that we would like to work ourselves out of business. We would like to reduce recidivism to the point that we didn't even need the prisons that we have today.
So we have a framework in place, a first step, and as we worked on this legislation, we were very clear that to deal with mass incarceration as an epidemic, we need sustained energy, sustained intensity, sustained effort, but we needed to start someplace with a first step. And we have to make sure that this first step, of course, is successful. And so my question for you is, because I believe the commitment is there, as was articulated by the Department of Justice, is what are the resources that are necessary to make sure that we can bring this programming to life, to really help the people who can use this programming in order for them to bring their natural talents and abilities and their hopes and dreams and aspirations into reality?
Yes, sir. We have had outstanding programs in the Bureau of Prisons for years. Our residential drug treatment program, our education programs, our prison industry programs we discussed, many good programs. Our limitation, though, was we never had enough resources to make those adequately available to all of the inmates to have the positive impact on all of the folks leaving our institutions. So that's where we come to today. Resources is going to be our biggest challenge. We requested funding in the 2019 budget. We got $75 million. We've ramped up our, as I said earlier, our education programs, our vocational training programs, and some other programs, bringing in our necessary staff to add to our drug treatment programs and our other model programs that it can impact the needs of the inmates. We've requested funding again for 2020 to increase those over even to a greater extent. We don't really know for sure yet what exactly our funding needs are going to be, because until we complete the needs assessment, apply that to all of our inmates, we don't know for sure what all the needs are going to be and what other programs we may need to add to our operations. But resources is going to be our single only impediment to fully actualizing the First Step Act.
Well, thank you. And I just want to thank, I know Chairwoman Bass acknowledged some of the individuals who are present with us today who have been released pursuant to the First Step Act. We fight for you. We appreciate your continued engagement and involvement and your willingness to be amongst us today. And I yield back.
Thank you for your leadership. Representative Lesko.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you both of you for coming here to testify. I have 5 questions, and they're all for you, Director Sawyer, and so if you could answer them fairly fast, that would be helpful so I don't run out of time. On August 12th, our committee, Chairman Nadler and Ranking Member Collins, wrote your office and department a letter asking about the Jeffrey Epstein death in the prison, and I was wondering what the status is of the AG's investigation into that.
I'm afraid that situation is still under investigation, and so I'm really not at liberty to say much about that just yet.
Okay. In the department's response to the committee's letter, there seemed to be a lot of blame on the suicide prevention program coordinator, a doctoral level psychologist, for taking Epstein off of suicide watch. Do you think that's an accurate assessment? And if so, was there any disciplinary action?
Okay. Again, I'm not at liberty to discuss the Epstein case in particular, but I would like to give a little more information on the Suicide Watch program because I think it's very misunderstood. Okay. I'm a psychologist. I've worked as a psychologist in the Bureau of Prisons with our inmates for many years. The Suicide Watch program is a very stark situation. If we deem you to be suicidal, imminently suicidal, we place you in a room with nothing in there except a mattress, a very thick, heavy kind of a gown that you would wear so that you could not use it to strangle yourself with or hang yourself with. And even with your eating utensils, you get kind of a scoop so that you can't hurt yourself with that. It's a very stark, and you're watched constantly. It's a very stark environment. It can become depressive if you're in there too long. Our average length of time in that status is about 24 hours. We then, though, have the option of moving an inmate to what we call psychological observation. They're still watched all the time, but they get clothes back, they get other reading materials and things in their room, they get more traditional bedding. It's a much different status, and so we do have the option of moving from one to the other. Suicide watch is not our only recourse.
Thank you. And there was reports that there was no video footage of his room when he died. Is that like normal procedure?
Again, I can't speak to the Epstein case, but I can say that a number of our camera systems are faulty and need to be repaired. In some of our institutions, especially our high-rises, we are working very diligently to upgrade, not only to replace the cameras, but get digitized cameras, which give you a much clearer picture as to exactly what's going on, and we are working to improve those in all of our institutions.
Thank you. And I'm switching people now to my last question, and this is about John Walker Lind, who 17 years ago was convicted of a couple things, but he was first indicted of conspiracy to murder U.S. citizens, 2 counts of providing material support and resources to terrorist organizations, 1 count of supplying services to the Taliban, and I can go on, basically assumed to be a terrorist. And then he was released this year after 17 years, so early, apparently on good time. Can you explain to me, there was reports that he is still professing in the belief of global jihad and a supporter of this Islamic State. How does somebody get released early if they're reportedly still professing those type of things?
The good conduct time that currently existed in the regulations prior to the First Step Act required an inmate to serve 85% of their sentence, and if they had no misconduct issues within the institution, they followed the rules and regulations, then we had to release them. You know, the Bureau of Prisons has really no control over when an inmate's sentence is up. Now, what we do with individuals who are terrorists in our system is we monitor them very carefully. Their mailings are monitored, their interactions are monitored. We feed that intelligence out to our law enforcement communities so that when that individual is released, the communities to which he's going, all the law enforcement personnel know exactly what they're getting, what their thinking is, and what, if any, possibility there could be of them reoffending. So that we see as our responsibility is once we have to release them, we make sure whoever's receiving them has as much intelligence as they can possibly have as to the status of that offender.
And thank you. We did good on timing, so thank you for that. And also, I want to applaud, I think it's good that we do have programs that people that are doing a good job and can contribute to the society, and so I applaud this committee for passing that type of legislation, and for you, wish you all the success, the people in the audience. Thank you.
Representative Jackson Lee.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and to the ranking member for convening this important hearing. And welcome, Madam Director. I think we've worked together in the past.
Yes, we have.
Delighted, I believe, that you are making history, and that is something to take note of. In the hearings that I've had today, each one of them I've mentioned our friend and colleague, the Honorable Elijah Cummings, and I will do it here and say that we will always be reminded of his seeking justice. And that is what we're doing here today. I would also like to associate myself with the words of Congressman Jeffries in the letter that he read to not use and misuse a vitally important program of restoration, to be against these kinds of programs. Let me start as well with a question about Mr. Epstein at the Metropolitan Correctional Center. I heard what you said, so I'm not asking for the details. What I am asking for is that the Congress, and I'm saying this because the DOJ is represented here, have this committee in particular, and I know our chairman certainly will have that done, but I want to be on the record that we want the full, unredacted report as to each action and response. And so I'm making that request to you. And I hope that you will adhere to it, Madam Director.
Yes. Yes, ma'am.
So let me go to a more generic question. I visited the Metropolitan Correctional, and I met with a lot of your, in my responsibilities on this committee, I met with a lot of the corrections officers, dedicated that they were. There is certainly an alluding to the circumstances of overly exhausted sleeping. What are you doing about the excessive overtime, the shortage? I heard something, but I want to be very pointed. Excessive overtime and the lack of time between days off and working. I understand when I spoke to these leaders at Metropolitan, they were barely getting any time off to go home and come back. They were doing 3 shifts. I'm just giving the kind of description. What are you doing about that? Because that certainly impacts justice, it impacts those who are detained, and impacts the workers.
Right. One of our biggest challenges right now is filling the 3,000 positions that we have vacant. And since I came on board 8 weeks ago, that's been a full court press of mine. We've hired 20-some new employees in our staffing offices to try to move the applicants much faster through this rather slow process of hiring. We've ramped up our recruiting process. We're getting new authorities from OPM to be able to give our institutions direct hire authority so they can hire straight from the
But
streets
you're
in their local
responding
communities.
as well to your present staff,
Right,
giving
and to our-
them some relief as well.
Absolutely.
I have a short period of time, so
Sorry.
we
Yeah, to our present staff, we are trying to use only voluntary overtime, we're trying not to mandate overtime. That's what causes us to use staff from other locations.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I am committed to a program that deals with addressing pregnant inmates, obviously women, and Samara legislation that I've included in some legislation that's made its way through the House and it's on to the Senate. And that is to be creative in dealing with women who are pregnant that may give birth while they're in prison. There are many different, how should I say, proposals. Mine deals with making sure that there is a bonding and that they're allowed to be with the child for a period of time. How open are you to that?
Absolutely. We have 6 MINT programs right now. We call them Mothers and Infants Together. 6 months from the time the birth occurs to 6 months after, the mother can be placed in a halfway house with her child to create that bonding connection. And then we also contract with the state of Washington for an ongoing program. If a woman is within 30 months of release, they can keep the baby with them for 30 months.
So
they have to be in Washington State, which is undesirable to some
So
inmates.
excellent, and what I will say is, so you won't mind that being codified, so they won't have to move to Washington State. I need to get to my other questions. Though it is not your responsibility, my legislation that was added to the First Step Act had to do with the independent committee. I know that it's been housed somewhere, but I would like you to comment on the value of having that oversight. And then lastly, would you please describe, with the DOJ, the policies in place that will allow inmates to contact counsel or file complaints when facilities experience emergencies, such as at MDC? So would you, the committee...
The Independent Review Committee on the First Step Act?
Yes.
I would defer to Tony.
The Independent Review Committee has been a valuable asset. We've appreciated an open working relationship with them, and they've provided very helpful suggestions and guidance, not only on the tool, on developing pattern, but also on evidence-based recidivism reduction programs, on needs assessment systems, and an overall implementation plan.
Well, the counsel, can these inmates get to counsel, inmates to counsel when these conditions are not working?
I'm not sure I understand your question, Congressman.
Can you describe the policies in place that would allow inmates to contact counsel or file complaints when facilities experience emergencies like at MDC?
Sure. They should have easy access to being able to contact an attorney. That's not a big concern for us. What happened, if you're talking about MDC at Brooklyn, when we had to shut down our attorney visits for a while because of the heating and air conditioning, heating and electrical problems. That was a temporary situation based upon our utilities problems, and we have put in place now ways to rectify that. Should it hopefully never happen again, but should it happen again, ways that we can get them access to the attorneys that they wish to contact.
I'm yielding back. I just want to say we have a detention center in my district, 20 years. I do want to give applause and praise to those staff persons there. And I heard that the independent committee, just for the record, I'm not asking for a response, it is not working, and so I want to follow it up at a later time. I yield back. Thank you, Madam Chair, for your courtesy.
Representative Klein.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this hearing. Thank you to the witnesses for being here today. Federal Bureau of Prisons plays an important role in protecting society and confining offenders while they serve out their sentences. And the First Step Act of 2018 includes three major components, as was discussed: correctional reform, sentencing reform, and reauthorization of the Second Chance Act. It's important to note that nationally and in my home state of Virginia, crime is at or near all-time lows, and this is a direct result of laws passed by Congress and by the states that ensure violent and dangerous offenders receive appropriate punishments for their offenses. And it's also important to remember and keep as a goal that victims of crime and their families should never be robbed of justice, and violent offenders must be held accountable by our criminal justice system. The First Step Act appropriately prevents violent offenders from earning additional time credits to reduce their sentences. In my home state of Virginia, the practice of discretionary parole release was abolished in 1995, and our truth in sentencing laws require convicted felons to serve at least 85% of the pronounced sentence, and they may earn at most 15% off in sentence credits, regardless of whether their sentence is served in a state facility or a local jail. At 23.4%, Virginia has the lowest recidivism rate in the country among the 43 states that report 3-year reincarceration rates for felons. Of the 12,000 offenders released from incarceration in Virginia in FY14 who had an opportunity to recidivate, 2,800 were reincarcerated within 3 years. Virginia's leading rate can be attributed to the effective reentry programs and treatments offered by Virginia Department of Corrections during an offender's incarceration and its effective supervision in the community after release. And I did note with interest the Federal Law Enforcement Officers Association letter to Chairwoman Bass and Ranking Member Ratcliffe asking for additional resources for probation officers and additional legislation to give them additional authorities to ensure their safety during their job of monitoring this increased number of prisoners who are being released. So I would ask Ms. Bacon, the First Step Act requires DOJ to develop a risk and needs assessment system to be used by BOP to assess the recidivism risk of all federal prisoners and to place prisoners in programs and produce productive activities to reduce this risk. Prisoners who successfully complete recidivism reduction programming and productive activities can earn additional time credits toward pre-release custody. Can you describe how this is being implemented, and are there any early indicators of success regarding the release under provisions of the First Step Act?
Yes, so step one is to develop the risk assessment tool called Pattern that we're in the final stages of updating, and we intend to publish in the very near future. Step two is then to screen every single inmate in the Bureau of Prisons by January 14th of 2020, the statutory deadline, through the risk and needs assessment system, so we can identify what is the individualized need, what's the particular need of each person to help reduce their recidivism risk. From there, the next step is to identify from a menu of evidence-based recidivism reduction programs, what is the program that's best suited to meet that individual's need. Then from there, we intend to monitor, study, and validate the programs to see, one, which programs are working, which should be expanded, where should we go with those? And to identify and be honest about which ones aren't working and that we might look to improve or that might need to be substituted with others. So that way, as we evolve and grow, we can maximize the number of beneficial programs that reduce recidivism and allow our communities to be safer.
Is there, are you going to be looking to states for examples of programs that may have worked in reducing recidivism as as models for you to use?
Yes, absolutely. That's been part of our research, is to examine states. And also, DOJ, in conjunction with the Independent Review Committee, recently took a trip to Canada to learn from our colleagues up north what programs they use, how effective they are, how they implement, how they measure. So we are looking to multiple sources to determine what are the possibilities out there, where is the strongest evidence, and what programs give our inmate population, the federal population, the best chance of success. Yes.
I was both a prosecutor and a defense attorney in Virginia, and on the Courts of Justice Committee there, so I'd encourage you to look to Virginia for some of the examples of programs that we've used to success. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I too want to acknowledge the loss of our extraordinary colleague, Elijah Cummings, and we have lost a great champion for justice and a passionate civil rights leader and someone who was a fighter for truth in the Congress of the United States, and we all remember him and honor his service. I also want to acknowledge the tremendous loss of the family of Troy Pine. I know a number of my colleagues have already acknowledged that. And while we all support criminal justice reform, the particular facts of this case, I know the court is reviewing, and we want to be sure that we understand how that happened, but most importantly, extend our condolences to his family. Director Sawyer, I wanted to start with you. I met with the individuals in my state who run the residential reentry centers. One of the things that they raised with me is that very often they get inmates from the Federal Bureau of Prisons that have done a lot of things like prepared resumes, gotten their IDs, but that often doesn't get transmitted to the residential reentry center. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of coordination between the Bureau of Prisons and the residential reentry centers, which is really undermining the ability of these individuals to reenter successfully. So I'm wondering what the Bureau of Prisons can do in partnership with the residential reentry centers to provide for a more seamless reentry for inmates, and what steps might be taken to ensure that, you know, some of the work that's been done on things like getting an ID and preparing a resume travels with that inmate to the residential reentry center so they have a leg up on this reentry work as they're getting back into a place where they're going to reenter the community.
To be honest, Congressman, I'm a little surprised to hear that being raised as a concern, because we have our staff from the central office and the local community corrections or reentry staff working directly with the halfway houses. So if there's a breakdown in some type of communication at that level, we will look specifically at those in your region and see what's happening.
That would be great.
We felt we had a pretty good line of communication there, but
and
we will double check it.
they've been involved in this work for quite a while in the whole New England region and have had the experience in various places. So if you would look into it,
definitely,
get back,
absolutely, sir.
Similarly, they also raised during that meeting that while the Bureau of Prisons has done a very good job in terms of moving people back into the community who are entitled to some reduction of their sentence as a result of this historic legislation, that the kind of backfilling of those spots for people who now become eligible under the First Step Act for residential placement, those spots aren't getting refilled. So I'm wondering, what is the status of the second part of this? You know, the first part is obviously getting people sentences reduced that get back into the community, but as a result of other sentence reductions, they now become eligible for residential placement. That doesn't seem to be happening, and they know that because a lot of their folks are getting released, but they're not having anybody refill them, and there are obviously people in the system who are eligible. So what's the status of that second part?
Well, we target all of our eligible inmates to go out through a residential reentry program because we feel that's a good halfway step back for them. At least 75% of our inmates releasing go through the halfway houses. We can't, though, guarantee that the right number are going to release into a particular district at the right time. So even if we contract for, say, 20 beds at this particular house, I can't guarantee we're going to release 20 inmates to that specific locality.
No, I understand. I guess maybe I'm not making myself clear. There are people who, because of the First Step Act, now are within close enough time to be to the end of their sentence that they're now eligible to be at a residential reentry center.
Right.
But they're still at the Bureau of Prisons.
Right.
So is that process of calculating where those people are so that they get placed in residential reentry centers and not wait at the Bureau of Prisons?
Yeah, that's an ongoing, like a revolving door that
Right.
we identify the inmates. We try to get them out within at least 6 months of their time. The average stay is about 5 months. We try to get them out there as quickly as we can.
But if you could look at the
we will
status and
definitely
get back
look
to me on
at
that,
your
because my
district, sir.
sense is the second half of that may be not happening.
We will look at that
Right.
for sure.
And my final question, Director, is The First Step Act requires the Bureau of Prisons to assess an evidence-based recidivism reduction programming or productive activity to each person incarcerated. It's not clear that the Bureau of Prisons has enough programs to meet this requirement at every facility. For example, one of the most popular evidence-based recidivism reduction programs within the Bureau of Prisons is the Residential Drug Abuse Program, and it frequently has a waiting list of 5,000 people. That was one in 2016, and sometimes requires individuals to transfer to a different facility, perhaps one with a higher security level than their previous facility. So access to evidence-based recidivism reduction is crucial to the successful implementation of the First Step Act. Does the Bureau of Prisons, does every BOP facility have an evidence-based recidivism reduction program as defined by the First Step Act? How many programs are in the BOP catalog? How many have wait lists? Is there more we need to do? Because that's a requirement, and if it just doesn't exist throughout the system, we have a problem.
The wait list on the drug program is a misnomer. We identify the drug program for the latter part of a person's sentence because research shows that if you could do it on the front end of their sentence, then they sit without drugs available in the institution, then they get out, we miss the point. So we schedule it later in their time. So the waiting list, we're going to need to change the name for that because it's a misnomer. It really is, we've kind of targeted when we want them to enter the program. We're going to have to back that up a little bit because now they can earn the credits and get out a little bit earlier, but they're really not waiting because we don't have beds. We have 86 of our institutions have residential drug treatment programs. We should be able to accommodate all of our inmates. If not, we mentioned earlier that funding is going to be an issue. With the new needs assessment coming, we're going to be able to identify very clearly what the needs of the inmates are, where we are short on programs in particular areas, and look to growing those programs as time goes on. We've had some money came to us in 19, 75 million. We're looking for at least another 75 million in the next one. We're targeting which programs we think we're going to need, but we won't know exactly what they are until this moves down the road a little bit, and we can identify the needs and develop the programs to match those.
And please let us know because we want to advocate for that.
Absolutely.
program,
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Madam Director, and I yield back. I yield back to myself. I'm yielding to myself. I now recognize the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Dean, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I thank Chairwoman Bass for holding this hearing. I come from Pennsylvania. I was a state representative before being elected in 2018 and wanted to serve on this committee. I served on judiciary there, and criminal justice reform is something I care deeply about. So I wanted to ask you in a couple of different areas. We know that criminal justice reform is an issue that we need to robustly address. According to a 2018 report by the Department of Justice, 83% of state prisoners released in 2005 across 30 states were arrested at least once in the 9 years following their release. That is 5 out of every 6 persons released. That number reveals to, I think, anybody that the rehabilitation of inmates, at least at that data point, was not working for inmates, was not working for our communities. We have made some progress in the right direction with the passage of the First Step Act, which seeks to decrease recidivism rates through a number of the tools that you've been discussing today. One of those tools is earned time credits that I'd like to learn more about. Earned by participating in recidivism reduction programming that can be used to decrease time spent in prison. Director Sawyer, could you briefly describe that programming and who designs that programming?
If I may, I would like to defer to the Department of Justice because they're handling that part of it more robustly.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yes, we're in the process of identifying evidence-based recidivism reduction programs, whether those be programs that are currently offered at the Bureau of Prisons or maybe programs that are offered in states or in other locations. The next step is to then match the programs with the individualized need. And that's a very important step because if someone's need is mental health, and they're in a drug program, that's not necessarily going to reduce their likelihood of recidivism. So that matching is key. And that's where training of BOP staff and using the experience and the education of the high quality staff we have is very important because part of this will be the staff matching the program to the individualized need.
Is that going on at this time?
Not yet. Where we are in the process now is identifying the menu of programs that have appropriate evidence. And this is an area where, in some cases, the research has been lacking And part of the First Step Act, what we're excited about, is it's definitely an inspiration to research and study these programs so we can have a better understanding of which programs are working.
I think that helps me bridge to the next conversation that I wanted to have. I want to focus on educational aspects of programming because education for people in prisons has a clear public safety benefit, reducing recidivism. I, too, am heartbroken at the death of the chairman, Elijah Cummings. I, as a little old freshman, had the honor of introducing legislation with him, and so I feel quite sad in his absence. He mostly, but I along with him, introduced the Promoting Reentry Through Education in Prisons Act, the PrEP Act. The bill would standardize Bureau of Prisons educational programs, creating an Office of Correctional Education within the agency. I was inspired by Elijah Cummings' leadership in this area. Are you familiar with that legislation, the PrEP legislation, either of you?
Somewhat, yes.
Okay. I'm eager to meet with you, meet with whomever, in order to try to get as much support as we possibly can for it. What we do know is if we could create a bureau and centralize the educational programming, best practices, meeting the assessment tools that are needed to identify the holes in the system in education and rehabilitation and put it across the system instead of just here and there, we believe it would make a huge difference.
Yeah, I was just going to say, we have education programs at every one of our institutions. We agree with every single thing that you're saying. One of the things First Step Act is going to help us with is it will incentivize inmates to take the programs. We require them to take education programs, literacy programs, and GED programs for 240 hours when they first come into the institution. Some of them stay with it, and we have a lot of folks get their GEDs and become literate in our institutions. But some of them get tired of it, and so they don't stay there because there was no, in their eyes, no benefit, no matter how much we might try to encourage them. Once we lost parole, we lost a lot of that incentive. Now with the First Step Act, with the earned credits, we've got a new incentive there for them that hopefully are going to keep these inmates in those programs much longer. So we applaud that.
I appreciate that, and I see my time has run out, but there's lots more to talk about, whether it's mandatory minimums or the programming around substance abuse disorder. I'd love to talk with you more.
Perfect.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentlelady. I now recognize the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Mucarsel Powell, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for coming here this afternoon. I think it's very important that we have the opportunity to discuss the First Step Act, which makes critical sentencing and prison reforms to the criminal justice system. It's so important that these reforms are implemented quickly and fairly, and those that are in the criminal justice system have that opportunity to have equal treatment. But I think it's important to talk about the state of the Bureau of Prisons because, as you've mentioned, it has a lot of issues. I think that you were hired just recently. How long have you been there now?
8 weeks.
8 weeks. And it didn't have a director for over a year, is that correct?
We had an acting director for 15 months.
Okay. And you've lost about 12% of your total staff, is that correct?
Right now we are down over 3,000 employees.
Is there a reason, you've only been there 8 weeks, but is there anything that you've seen that can explain why there's such a shortage of staff right now in the Federal Bureau of Prisons?
Well, we had very inconsistent budgets for several years and threats of losing positions. And so we were concerned about not hiring up too much and then risking having to RIF them because in some of the budgets we were threatened with losing positions. 1 year we kept our positions but lost the funding for like 1,500 positions. It's been very inconsistent in terms of both our position allotment and our budgets. And so a lot of that caused us to kind of get behind the curve with filling our positions, and now we find ourselves with a 3,000 backlog in empty positions.
Well, one of the reasons why I'm asking that is because I know that there have been complaints in one of the Federal Bureau of Prisons in Miami because of the working conditions. Right. They have actually had to file several OSHA complaints, and the union has stated that the working conditions are just very dire for them at this point. So have you had a chance to look over those complaints?
Yes, the issue at Miami, at least, was mold, and the climate down there is very conducive to mold. Once anyone identifies any mold, and we ask all of our staff to be vigilant all the time in terms of any life safety issues, whether it's with the inmates and staff, or whether it's the facility. As soon as we identify the possibility of a mold concern, we right away come in, we do the mold assessment, we bring in OSHA, we bring in the contractors to repair them.
They had to file it more than once. So, but now that you're
It
there.
recurred
Yes.
is what happened. We got the mold eradication was completed, we thought it was all taken care of, and then we found it occurring in another part of the institution. So those things concern us very much, and we
Just give
try.
me an update, yes.
We will do
on-
that,
on
thank you.
But I know that you can't really get into details with the Jeffrey Epstein case, but as you can imagine, and I think it was the Attorney General that stated that Mr. Epstein's death raised serious concerns that must be addressed. So if you can just walk me through, what are the specific mental health and suicide prevention training that you provide the personnel that deal with these issues?
All of our staff, when they come into the Bureau of Prisons, suicide prevention training is part of their training at the institution level, at our training academy in Glencoe, Georgia. We impress upon them suicide prevention. We also, every year in our annual training, we do again suicide prevention training. One of our vulnerable areas is our special housing units, where inmates are kind of secluded from everyone else. We do quarterly training with the staff there to stay on top of suicide prevention issues. We do a lot of training with our staff. And the issue oftentimes is that the inmates, they understand the program too, and if the inmates truly want to die, they know how to kind of, and let me say it a little differently. We try to give every inmate a roommate so that they're never completely alone. And just the other day, we had an inmate that died by suicide, and he waited until his roommate was taken out of the cell for recreation, and took his life during that time frame. So my only point, and again, I'm a doctoral level psychologist, I've worked suicide prevention in our institutions for years. It is very, very difficult for those who do not identify any likelihood.
And I only have a few
Sure,
seconds.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, Ms. Hoyer,
I'm
really
sorry.
quickly, but it seems to be reported that there was a staffing issue in that particular prison, and because of the augmentation policy, it was someone else that was actually on watch of Mr. Epstein. Is that correct?
I cannot speak to anything specifically about Mr. Epstein. It's still under investigation.
Okay,
So,
thank you.
okay.
I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady, and I thank the ranking member for her accommodation. I just wanted to ask, one thing we really haven't touched on in this hearing, and it's one of the real purposes of it, is the Independent Review Commission's obligation to assist in reviewing and validating the risk and needs assessment system. So my first question is, what was the feedback and advice from the Independent Review Committee regarding the development of the pattern, and what steps were taken to incorporate that advice? Because that's a really central part of this act.
The Independent Review Committee engaged with us almost immediately on formation and was involved with the development of pattern really from the inception. The Independent Review Committee met not only with us at DOJ working on the implementation, but also had a direct pipeline to the contractors, Drs. Hamilton and Dewey, who were actually developing the tool. So along the way, the Independent Review Committee provided advice to the contractors, gave suggestions on different ways the tool could be improved and developed, and that relationship has continued through July 19th, and as recently as, I believe it was approximately 2 weeks ago, we had another meeting with the Independent Review Committee where they again gave suggestions to us on how we could improve the tool. So I would describe it as a collaborative working relationship, and we have certainly benefited the department from their advice and their experience in the development of the tool.
And will that information that you are developing and collecting in this process be shared with members of this committee? Can we have that assurance?
In terms of what advice and
Well, whether or not the recommendations for changing it have been incorporated, what the error rate is, whether this system or this evaluation tool is working. I mean,
Yes,
that's the purpose of the Independent Review Committee, and we'd like to know how the Bureau of Prisons is responding to that set of recommendations.
Yes, it's very important to us that the tool is working accurately. We share your concern there. We want a tool that's accurate and fair. That's the goal going in.
No, I understand that, but my question is a specific one. Will you share with the committee the results of that analysis and assessment, both what the recommendation of the Independent Review Committee is and what the Bureau of Prisons, what actions you are taking or not taking with respect to their recommendations?
Yes, to the extent that's possible, we intend to provide as much information as the committee needs, yes.
Thank you very much. We'll follow up with you on it. Thank you very much. With that, I will thank both of our witnesses for your testimony, and I know that Our rules provide for an opportunity to provide some written questions, which we will do, but I would also ask unanimous consent that a statement for the record from the Brennan Center for Justice be included as part of the record without objection, and a statement from the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, which reminds me of just one final question. On October 8th, there was a FOIA request from the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, which, among other things, seeks specific information, including raw data that was used to develop pattern. To the extent that such information is in your possession, will you commit to turn it over as part of that FOIA request?
We are in the process of reviewing that FOIA request and are processing it.
Is that a yes? Yes-ish.
I can say that we're processing the request.
We'll look forward to receiving the information for the committee and go from there. But we really thank you for your time and for the testimony before the committee. At this time, thank you again, Dr. Sawyer and Ms. Bacon. We'll now proceed to our second panel, and I'd ask our second panel witnesses to please come forward. Oh, my pleasure. Thank you. I got you. Order. Thank you and welcome to our witnesses. We are delighted today to be joined by David Patton. Mr. Patton is the head of the Federal Public Defender offices for the Southern and Eastern Districts of New York. He oversees all aspects of offices and employees, while also chairing the National Federal Defender Legislative Committee and the Southern District of New York Panel Review Committee, which makes recommendations about attorneys to be selected as appointed counsel on the CJA panel. Mr. Patton teaches evidence to all new federal defenders at annual national training and represents individual clients in federal criminal cases. And we welcome you, Mr. Patton. We're joined by Melissa Hamilton. Dr. Hamilton is an expert on risk assessments and holds a doctorate in criminology. She's a former judicial clerk on the United States Courts of Appeal for the Fifth Circuit and a former editor of the Texas Law Review. Today, Dr. Hamilton teaches at the University of Surrey School of Law in the UK. She's a member of the American Psychological Association and has published dozens of articles in law reviews and scientific journals on a variety of topics. Some of her main areas of focus are conducting interdisciplinary research on issues of risk assessment practices, policing, sentencing, and corrections. Dr. Hamilton is a former police officer and a corrections officer. Welcome, Dr. Hamilton. John P. Walters. Mr. Walters is the chair of the Independent Review Committee designed to oversee the implementation of the First Step Act. He is also the chief operating officer of the Hudson Institute, director of the Hudson Institute Political Studies, and co-director of the Center for Substance Abuse Policy Research of the Hudson Institute. And welcome, Mr. Walters. Andrea James. Ms. James is the founder and executive director of the National Council for Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls. She's also the founder of Families for Justice's Healing and the author of Upper Bunkies Unite and Other Thoughts on the Politics of Mass Incarceration. Ms. James is a 2015 Soros Justice Fellow and a recipient of the 2016 Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Award, which is a very distinguished award, so congratulations. Her work is focused on ending incarceration of women and girls. We welcome you, Ms. James. And we welcome all of our distinguished witnesses and thank them for participating in today's hearing. Now, if you would all please rise, I will begin by swearing you in. Please raise your right hands. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you are about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, so help you God? Thank you. Let the record show the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Thank you, and you may be seated. Please know that each of your written statements will be entered into the record in its entirety. Accordingly, I ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes. To help you stay within that time, there's a timing light on your table. When the light switches from green to yellow, you have 1 minute to conclude your testimony. When the light turns red, it signals your 5 minutes is up. And Mr. Patton will begin. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Thank you very much for holding this hearing. As you said, I head the Federal Public Defender Office in New York City, and together with my colleagues around the country, fellow public defenders and appointed counsel, we represent anyone charged with a federal crime too poor to afford a lawyer. And that means at any given time, nationwide, we represent 80 to 90% of all federal criminal defendants. I want to pause for a moment to join the expressions of sorrow about the loss of Representative Cummings. He was a great champion for our work and a great champion for our clients, and we are all going to miss him dearly. The First Step Act and the Department of Justice's implementation of it and the Bureau of Prisons' implementation of it will impact the lives of our clients enormously. First, as has been discussed, the Act requires DOJ to develop an algorithm, a scoring system, to assess every federally incarcerated person's risk of recidivism and needs for programming and treatment. That score that people receive will directly impact how much time they spend in prison. It is vital because some people may receive no time off of their sentence, others may receive many months or years off. And it's vital that that scoring system, the development of it, be transparent, that it be fair, that it be valid, and that it be unbiased. And I have to say, unfortunately, I have some serious concerns about those at the outset. First of all, there has not been as much transparency as there should be in the development of this system, and I think we're going to hear more about that. Secondly, what we do know about it suggests there's a real danger of very serious racial bias in the use of this system. And again, I think we're going to hear more about that. In addition to the scoring system, so much of the success of the First Step Act will depend on the Bureau of Prisons greatly increasing the programs and treatment offerings that it currently offers, and on much more robust reentry planning. And once again, I think there's a lot of reason for concern. First of all, for years, the Bureau of Prisons has not had sufficient programming and treatment for the demand. Many of its programs really do work, and they ought to be improved and they ought to be added to, but they haven't been. And with the First Step Act, that demand is only going to increase. So if we haven't been able to do it for years, pre-FSA, I think there's real cause for concern moving forward. And secondly, on reentry, the Bureau of Prisons has been moving in the wrong direction. They've been closing reentry centers for the past few years. And once again, the need is only going to grow under the First Step Act. Lastly, I'll say this about reasons to be worried about the Bureau of Prisons' performance moving forward. It has a very troubling history, certainly in my jurisdiction, of not creating conditions in prison to help people succeed when they get out. I wrote in my written submission at some length about some of the really horrific problems we have had at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn and the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan, two very large pretrial federal detention centers. In particular, last winter, during one of the coldest stretches in New York City's history, they lost power for a week and they had serious problems with their heating. And frankly, the MDC's response to that was disgraceful. And it included, and I don't use this word lightly, outright lies by MDC officials minimizing what was going on and providing incorrect information about what was going on that did real harm to our clients. And in the wake of that disaster, the warden of that prison, MDC, was promoted. He now oversees, to my understanding, 3 large institutions in Pennsylvania. And so I am very concerned about accountability at the Bureau of Prisons. I also hope I'll get a chance to respond to some of Director Sawyer's responses to Chairman Nadler, because some of them were just plain incorrect, I'm afraid to say. I'll conclude my opening remarks with this. The stakes for successful implementation of the First Step Act are very high. As everyone here has recognized, the overwhelming number of people who enter prison will be coming out and will become our neighbors again soon. If they are treated with harshness and neglect and inhumanity while they are in prison, they are much more likely to respond in kind when they get out. Robust programming, a fair assessment system, and real thoughtful reentry planning are key to making that happen, but if history is a guide, without vigorous oversight, it won't happen, and that's why I'm grateful to this committee for holding this hearing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Patton. The chair now recognizes Dr. Hamilton for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman and Ranking Member, for this opportunity to speak on this important piece of legislation and to educate about this risk assessment tool. There is a bright side here whereby the pattern tool has been unveiled, at least I understand now the initial version, despite the very short time frame given. Still, as with any newly developed risk tool, there are many concerning issues that must be addressed in its implementation in order to achieve the well-intended goals of the First Step Act. I wish to address 3 key topics: transparency, accuracy, and fairness. On transparency, an unfortunate problem with many risk tools is their black box nature, by which developers keep much information secret from the public and the users. This sort of secrecy plagues Pattern as well. Even though the DOJ released a report that contains some interesting data about Pattern, the document is conspicuously vague while not disclosing a host of information that is necessary to fully understand Pattern and its warts. Secrecy often undermines risk tool implementation because stakeholders just do not trust it. And confidence by stakeholders is a necessary condition for success. For example, the Brennan Center for Justice reports that it requested a document regarding Bravo, which is the pre-existing BOP-owned risk assessment tool on which Pattern is based. Yet Brennan reports they were rebuffed with a claim of that it was proprietary. The issue of trust is further evidence whereby the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers has an outstanding FOIA request for the data sets, which was presented a little bit earlier, that would allow independent researchers then to conduct a third-party audit about Pattern's abilities and fairness because of the gaps in transparency thus far. I urge the DOJ and NIJ to comply with what is a reasonable FOIA request. This leads me to the second point about accuracy. The report asserts the tool was validated, but for validation, developers used a very limited definition, which simply signifies the tool's ability to rank recidivists better than a coin toss. The tool produces high error rates. By sort of reverse engineering the numbers the DOJ has provided, I found high false positive rates, which means assessing individuals at higher risk when they actually did not reoffend. Overall, Pattern produces a false positive rate for general recidivism of 32%. For violent recidivism, the false positive rate is at 46%. Indeed, the acceptance of a much higher false positive rate over false negatives appears contrary to the aims of the First Step Act to incentivize more prisoners to pursue rehabilitative programs and productive activity. The high number of false positives seems unnecessary considering the risk outcomes here are not meant to inform immediate release, and thus public safety is not compromised. Indeed, prisoners who committed the most serious offenses were already excluded from the First Step law in the first place. There's an easy fix here. Simply move the cut points higher so that a greater number of individuals have at least the opportunity to earn rewards for taking measures to reduce their risk profiles. And my third point is fairness. Pattern exhibits disparate impact, as evidenced by the DOJ report itself. Pattern assesses as medium and high risk a substantially larger percentage of minorities. For instance, consider those in those higher risk categories, and thus not able to gain the full benefits of the First Step Act. For males, the rates of higher risk categories for whites is 43%, compared to Hispanics at 53%, and then African Americans at 73% in the highest risk categories. Further evidence of racial and ethnic disparities is that Pattern, at least as it now stands, simply is not calibrated equally across racial and ethnic groups. In other words, a medium or high risk scores associated with different recidivism rates along racial lines, indicating either over or under prediction. A potential fix to this problem, though, is to limit what is counted to serious crimes, because as it currently stands, pattern counts any criminal act, even minor acts of deviance, in its criminal history measures and recidivism outcomes. Changing these definitions may well reduce the inequities for minorities. Overall, I believe pattern has some merit, yet improvements could better serve this reform. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Hamilton. Now recognize Mr. Walters for 5 minutes. If you could just turn on your microphone. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to express my sympathy as well to you, the colleagues of Congressman Cummings. When I last served in the White House Drug Policy Office, he was Chairman Cummings, my authorizing chairman. He was a steadfast partner and energetic, and most of all, he was a good man. And I know you miss him. I miss him as well. I'm here representing as a member of the Independent Review Committee. We didn't actually have a chairman. We work as a group of 6 experts designed to give advice to the Justice Department as specified under the Act. We have a range of individuals, some of whom's qualifications are also specified in the Act, but they have a broad array of backgrounds in risk and needs assessment and management of similar federal programs and policies, and in helping to run institutions of corrections at the federal and state level, as well as broad published backgrounds in international journals and associations on these matters. We have worked with the Justice Department since the beginning of the work on the pattern risk assessment tool, but we've also been working on the needs assessment and the programming implementation with regard to the implementation of the First Step Act. You know this is a massive change in the structure and purpose and mission of the Bureau of Prisons and our correction system. It's a first step, obviously designed to convey change throughout the United States criminal justice system, from one that's just holding people as a part of a criminal sentence to giving them a chance to transform their lives and re-enter society as productive individuals. That requires a great deal of work, some of which is detailed within the Act itself, as you know. We've worked on a couple things since the release of the July 19th report. Prior to that report, we did work with the department and the contractors designing the pattern system, as well as some of the initial work on the matching needs assessment and programming. But since the release of that report, we have worked extensively to advise on the refinement of the pattern system. Our goal has been to reduce bias in the pattern instrument, both perceived and real bias in the instrument's elements and the way in which the algorithm is formulated. We've been allowed through the Department of Justice to work directly with the contractors, and they've run over 200 hours of analysis at our direction to test additional sensitivity and to test for bias within the instrument. We have made a series of recommendations to the Department of Justice about changing the pattern instrument, some of which would be somewhat substantial change to the structure of the instrument to remove any concern about bias while continuing to predict risk. We obviously we all want the instrument to be valid, but we also want the instrument to capture real differences and not bias. In addition, we provided proposals on needs assessment. We haven't talked as much about that, but that is obviously a key part of the First Step Act and the need to match the programming in the Bureau of Prison Systems to the needs as determined by a fair assessment of the individuals coming into the federal system. The range of programs here is somewhat limited in current structure, and the evaluation of those programs is even more limited, we have found. So the structure of both identifying the proper way of assessing individuals and matching them to programs is critical, and that's ongoing. We've also We've also provided additional advice on making the system more transparent, providing some of the information previous witnesses have asked, and also providing information on how the system's working now and what's happening to released individuals in closer to real time, so we can see how the system's evolving. Finally, I'd like to make one point about resources, which has been touched on earlier, but I think all of us on the committee believe is critical. The $75 million that has been authorized and we hope will be appropriated for the implementation of the First Step Act, of course, amounts to about $400 per individual in the federal prison system. The $7 billion roughly FY 2019 appropriation, it's a small drop in the bucket. It's not enough. I would estimate, just my personal estimate of what's going to be needed here for a fair set of implementation, training, staffing, building things like classrooms in prison institutions that now exist, is somewhere in the neighborhood of $300 million to begin with, and then programming down the line at $500 million. I would also strongly urge that at least 10% of those funds always go for evaluation and research and development of programs and refinement of the process of running these programs. If you don't do this, what you're going to have is a system that simply can't meet the expectations, the high expectations that have been stated, because it's just not going to have the resources in an institution, the Bureau of Prisons, which is already understaffed and can't meet its current staffing levels. Thank you.
Ms. James.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also would like to thank Madam Chairwoman Bass and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for this opportunity. I also would like to, for the National Council, on behalf of the National Council, express our sympathy on the loss of Congressman Cummings. He was a huge champion for us and always had an open door policy for our concerns. And so we will truly miss him. Thank you again for this opportunity. Again, my name is Andrea James. I'm the Executive Director of the National Council for Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls. National Council is a membership-based organization working to end the incarceration of women and girls. It's an honor for me to share our views on implementation of the First Step Act and next steps Congress should take to transform the criminal legal system. Regarding the First Step Act implementation, reforming the criminal legal system is one of the most important issues of our time. This country incarcerates more people than any other developed nation in the world, with over 2 million people incarcerated, an increasing number of whom are women and girls. At the federal level, we incarcerate approximately 177,000 people, 45% of whom are incarcerated for a federal drug offense, and a disproportionate number of whom are Black and brown. This is a national crisis that Congress must address. When the passage of the First Step Act, Congress attempted to build on several important reforms that preceded it, the Second Chance Act of 2008 and the Fair Sentencing Act of 2010, to continue to move the ball forward. And while there have been some modest but important improvements to the system as a result of the passage of the First Step Act, giving judges greater discretion to depart from mandatory minimum sentences, making the Fair Sentencing Act retroactive, reducing some mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenses, ending juvenile solitary confinement, expanding compassionate release, and increasing good time credit to reduce sentence lengths for individuals currently incarcerated, there remain key issues with respect to its implementation and more work that needs to be done to transform the system. As a membership organization with members inside and outside of prisons, we receive dozens of emails a week from women who are confused about the First Step Act, having received conflicting information, making it difficult for many incarcerated people to take advantage of what the First Step Act has to offer. Much of the confusion has been the result of the exclusions that were included within the bill and completely bar far too many people from the Act's benefits. Literally, 68 categories of people may not receive earned time credits, despite their successful participation in educational programming, essentially closing the door on individuals who most need help in preparation for a successful return to our communities. Also excluded are people who are slated to be deported after their sentence is completed, denying them any chance to prepare in any way for that transition. As we look towards the future, Congress must work to avoid unnecessary exclusions that ultimately undermine efforts to rehabilitate people. Regarding the risk assessment tool, we are concerned that the tool will incorrectly identify women as likely to recidivate based on static measures such as the crime for which they were convicted. We therefore urge that the approach to developing the risk assessment tool be modified. The circle of people involved in developing the tool must be widened to include the expertise of qualified, formerly incarcerated people. The Hudson Institute is hosting the development team and has selected academics who may have strong technical credentials, but none of whom have direct experience with the criminal legal system. Experiences of currently incarcerated people must also shape the development of the risk assessment tool. By definition, women serving decades-long sentences will be flagged as high risk. In fact, they are the opposite. Women who are serving long sentences are integral to the day-to-day functioning of the prisons. They teach other incarcerated women and prison staff the procedures of the prison, including training for industry jobs, such as Unicor. Long-timer women counsel new women adjusting to life in prison, provide comfort and advice to those separated from their children, and mediate interpersonal conflicts. These contributions should be captured in the risk assessment tool. Women like those who have traveled here with me today, Virginia Douglas, Justine Moore, Tahiba Bain, all having served decades in a federal prison and now leading the movement to end incarceration of women and girls, could contribute significantly to the risk assessment discussion and development in addition to the statisticians. Finally, credit for earned time must be assessed retroactively, taking into consideration the ways many incarcerated people already have made great strides in their personal transformation against great odds during years of incarceration. Ultimately, we recommend that Congress ensures the Department of Justice addresses all of these issues before anyone is assessed by the pattern tool. Regarding next steps, directly impacted people must have a seat at the table. As experts in the field, our goal is to encourage meaningful reform, and we are entitled to ongoing, meaningful opportunity to explain why we don't believe something goes far enough and what else is possible, such as our fight for inclusion of retroactivity. I was incarcerated at the federal prison for women in Danbury, Connecticut during the passage of the Fair Sentencing Act and the fix of the sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine. I will wrap up with it was painful to see how many deserving women could not benefit from its passage because two sentencing provisions were not applied retroactively, and it's why we fought to include retroactivity not only for FSA, but also for changes to 3 strikes, 2 strikes, and 924C offenses in the First Step Act.
Thank you. We'll now proceed with questioning under the 5-minute rule. I'll recognize myself for the first questioning. Mr. Patton, I understand you had some problems with the answers that I got in the questions I asked the director about the crisis at the MDC in Brooklyn and the response to it. Could you elaborate?
I will. And I don't mean to blame Director Sawyer. I know she's only been in the position for 2 months, so she wasn't around when the crisis happened.
It's all her fault.
But I think she's been misinformed about some of the things you asked her about. First of all, I just had a meeting with the Associate Warden of the MDC 2 days ago because I'm trying to follow up with them on a number of these things. And I asked the very same question you did about long sleeve and thermal attire because they're not there yet on fixing the HVAC system, as Director Sawyer acknowledged, and we're coming up on winter. And the answer I got was, no, we're not going to do that. People are
not going to get thermal.
That will not become part of the standard issue. We will buy extra sets in case we have an emergency, but that is not what the recommendation is because there is an ongoing problem. It needs to be part of the standard issue. Now that sounds like a small thing until you sit in a 60-degree cell in paper-thin short-sleeve scrubs. It's a real issue, and that was just wrong, at least as compared to what the MDC is telling us. She said that the people with the CPAP machines were offered to move. Now, I know, Chairman, you were present on one of these tours. I was personally there. I mean, that's news to me, is all I'll say about that. Those people were terrified. They were terrified that their life was in danger. They were suffering. They were not given an option to move somewhere else. And so it's important to correct the record on that, because if there's not an acknowledgement that the problem existed, I'm worried about a solution being put in place to solve it moving forward. Lastly, she said that there was a communication problem, that the MDC officials forgot to communicate on some of these things. There was no forgetting to communicate. We were peppering them with questions, and we were getting demonstrably false answers back about what was going on there. That was not negligence. It was not a slip of the mind among the BOP officials there. It was intentionally misleading us about what was happening in the
To
institution.
your knowledge, has anyone been disciplined or admonished for intentionally misleading?
Quite the opposite. My understanding is that the warden at the time, Warden Quay, not long after this incident was promoted, and he now oversees multiple institutions. That's my understanding from press accounts.
Well, it's my understanding too, and I must say that he was, when I was there, completely unresponsive. Let me ask this. Section 404 is a section of the First Step Act that made the Fair Sentencing Act of 2010, which addressed the crack powder cocaine sentencing disparity, retroactive. Although the text of the First Step Act presents a straightforward application, the Department of Justice, we understand, regularly takes the position that retroactivity is not appropriate. In your experience, and for federal defendants across the country, how is the retroactive application of the crack penalty reforms of Section 404 being applied? Are they being applied?
You know, at the end of the day, the vast majority of judges are doing the right thing, I think. But it's not because the Department of Justice is making it easy. In fact, they're taking very strained and aggressive litigation positions that have been highly criticized by judges. So for instance, one example on the retroactive application of the Fair Sentencing Act, the crack quantities, they're saying our clients are not eligible for relief because we could have charged a higher quantity back when. And so the judge should take into account what we could have proven or what we could have done.
In the absence of a new trial, how can they do that?
Exactly. It's unconstitutional. It's not fair. And perhaps most significantly, it's just contrary to the language of the law and the statute and what Congress intended. There are two separate aspects to the retroactive application of the Fair Sentencing Act. There's eligibility, and then there's the discretion of the judge about whether or not to reduce the sentence. The law doesn't require judges to reduce a sentence. And for the Department of Justice to say people are...
The law does not require.
The law does not require a reduced sentence. It imposes upon the judge a duty to decide whether somebody is eligible. And then if they are eligible, the judge takes into account all of the usual sentencing factors and decides whether or not to reduce the sentence. And for the Department of Justice to make really strained arguments on the eligibility side is disappointing. And it means that even though thousands of judges are going, or not thousands of judges, but in thousands of cases are going our way on these arguments, a handful are not, and they're being selective about how they then appeal those, because they can be selective about what they appeal and what they don't. So they're being very aggressive about trying to create bad law from our perspective.
So the Justice Department is trying to sabotage the retroactivity feature of Section 404.
They're doing their best, in my opinion.
Thank you. I have one further question. You mentioned racial and ethnic disparities and disparate treatment in your testimony. How is pattern risk assessment tool still unfair with regard to race and ethnicity? And can you give us some examples, specific examples? I'm sorry, that's for Ms. Hamilton.
Yeah.
Dr. Hamilton.
I'm glad it's for Ms. Hamilton.
Dr. Hamilton, yes.
Yes, so I think I have some slides that can go up. First, let us do, for example, slide 4B. So hard to see, but what slide 4B is doing is giving you an indication for males. These are the percentages based on race of those individuals who fall in the minimum and low category and therefore gain the best benefits of pattern. And so you can see significant differences based on race of this eligibility in order to earn early release and to be incentivized to go through a lot of programs. And then my next one, if we can go to 2B, please. So this one is the idea also, this is for females, 2B. Sorry, I know we're skipping around. Well, the next one will be about, I had talked about differences in calibration. I wanted to show you what it meant. For females, so for females, this is going to be on the violent recidivism rate. And what you'll notice on the bottom then is on the left-hand side is those who are assessed females at minimum risk versus low, medium, and then on the right-hand side is high. And what you're seeing there in the bars are the recidivism rates of individuals who were categorized within those 4 risk categories. And notice then in each of those that, and I'm sorry that it's very small, but what you're seeing is racial disparity. So in any of the 4 groups where you're seeing differences in height, that's by race, meaning that, for example, a medium risk outcome doesn't mean the same based on risk. Or high, it just doesn't mean high risk means something different based on racial groups for females, at least in violent recidivism. But I do want to say I'm very happy to hear from Mr. Walters that they are correcting for, I would assume, something like this.
Thank you very much. My time has expired. Gentlelady from Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, all of you, for being here, first of all. My first question is for Ms. James, and I applaud your effort to reduce incarceration of women and children, but a couple times during your testimony, you said your goal was to end totally incarceration for women and children, and I think in your written testimony, you said you're committed to abolishing incarceration for women and girls. How are you going to do that? Aren't there some women that deserve to be in prison?
Well, I think that it's a bold mission that we have taken on, but we also have been incarcerated women. We have all lived in prisons. We know for sure, after that experience, that that environment, as prisons currently exist in this country, will never help a woman to truly heal and advance her life. And so we know, because we have been for some years now working on looking at what else is possible for women, what else is possible for girls, mostly things that are created within the communities that the women and girls come from, that could immediately significantly reduce the incarceration numbers of women and girls, and then help us to advance ideas about women who may be causing harm to other people, that will need some other source of resource other than just community-led programming. But certainly, a prison is not the place that will help us to do that.
Thank you. I was just curious because I was like, there's some people, I think, that can be released and into society, and it's good, but other people I'm not so sure about. That there's some people that need to be in prison is what I'm saying.
May I just mention something?
Ma'am, if you don't mind, I have other questions, and I only have 5 minutes, so thank you. Mr. Walters, I guess there's been a few criticisms and concerns about the review committee and the tool and the assessment and that type of thing. Would you like to address anything that's been said?
Well, I think there were some initial concerns about the committee and the background of the people, but I included the backgrounds in my written testimony. I won't take your time to read the backgrounds of the individuals, but they have a diverse group of points of view, but they're highly professional in what they've done, and the Justice Department has listened to us. We've sat with the Attorney General, the Deputy Attorney General, as well as Ms. Bacon and some BOP officials, and we've gone through a lot of these items, I think, in a way that is intended by the law. I mean, our job is to advise. And our job is to advise as under the law the Attorney General, and we've tried to address some of these issues about the structure of the instrument, but also the task that's involved here, the compression of time for implementation, the need to look at these programs. And as I mentioned earlier, one factor here that has to be recognized is the Bureau of Prisons has not evaluated its programs. I mean, to bring some of these programs in, they're going to try to bring in programs that have links to programs that are evaluated or in areas that we think will make a difference, but they're going to have to go back and look at how to certify and make them effective. Otherwise, you're going to have people sitting in programs that really don't do a good job in helping them with the needs they have. The whole needs assessment system has limits, and we've suggested some ways of using some unconventional instruments to look at needs and to measure whether programs are meeting those needs using things like functional improvement in people's behavior. So we're not just waiting until we look at what happens after they've been released for 3 years, after they've already been in the system. So some of those things are more radical changes. They'll, as I said, cost more money to train and implement these things in the Bureau of Prisons. But if you want to meet the goals of the Act, which I think everybody here wants to do, if you want to meet the goals of the Act, our job is to kind of give our best opinions, and we have a range of them from different backgrounds on what that takes. I have nothing negative to say about the Justice Department's willingness to listen to us. They have a tough job in implementing it. If they implement it, we don't.
Thank you, Mr. Walters. I do have one more question. And this one is for Mr. Payton. Mr. Payton, I got some information that the federal prison industries has struggled over the past number of years, and it was kind of surprising to me that there was a reduction. Well, let me read what it says. Since 2009, federal prison industry sales have dropped 47%, and we've experienced financial losses totaling $182 million. During this time, the FPI, or Federal Prison Industries, has closed or mothballed about 40 factories. This reflects a reduction of more than 2/3 in the percentage of eligible inmates working in the program from 25% in 2000 to less than 8% in 2016. And this was like really surprising to me. I'm from Arizona, and we have a fairly successful program, the Arizona Correctional Industries. And at least in Arizona, I think I've heard from industries, everybody I talked to said they're in great need of workers, right? And so in Arizona, we even have people working as mechanics on trucks, big semi-trucks, and so it's a good workforce. They come, they learn a skill, and then they're able to use that skill when they're released. And so do you have any idea why this is happening? I think it's part of this program that we're supposed to be getting more people to work. I don't understand what's happening here.
I wish I had an answer for you. I think that's probably a good question for Director Sawyer. But I agree with you. That is one of the programs that has really been proven to reduce recidivism, and there's just not enough of it. And there are other programs that similarly, whether it's drug treatment or mental health counseling, that we know would reduce recidivism, improve people's lives, and there's just not enough of it. And it's why I mentioned in my opening statement that I have real concerns that the programming is there to really make the First Step Act a success.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I agree with you. In Arizona, I was quite impressed with what they all do. I mean, you have a whole call center where people, there's this in the women's prison, where people don't realize when they're getting answers on something that it's from a woman prisoner inside the prison. And obviously, they're very dedicated and show up to work all the time. So anyway, thank you all for your testimony. I appreciate it.
Gentlelady yields back. That concludes our hearing today. I want to thank our witnesses. I want to thank our members for attending. I want to thank our witnesses. And with that, the hearing will stand adjourned.